Sometimes the biggest mistake a man can make is thinking no one is coming. The night air hung heavy as red and blue lights painted the quiet suburban street in restless flashes, casting long shadows across the pavement where Danielle Brooks stood alone beside her car, her hands visible, her posture calm. Almost too calm for someone facing the cold authority of Officer Ryan Cole, who stood a few feet away, shoulders squared, voice sharp with suspicion, his presence filling the silence like a warning no one dared interrupt. Imagine standing there, under those lights, with strangers watching from their porches and behind half-closed blinds, phones raised but voices silent, the kind of silence that says people have seen this before and learned not to get involved. Ryan's eyes narrowed as he studied her, not really seeing her, just seeing what he had already decided she was, someone who didn't belong, someone who needed to be questioned, controlled, corrected. "You fit the description," he said flatly, even though there was no urgency in the air, no real danger, just a quiet woman on her way home after a long day. Danielle's gaze didn't drop, didn't shake. It held steady, locked on his in a way that felt out of place, like she knew something the rest of the street didn't. The wind brushed lightly against her jacket, carrying the faint hum of distant traffic and the soft buzz of electricity from the overhead lines. Everything ordinary, everything still, except for the tension tightening between them. Ryan shifted his stance, one hand hovering near his belt as if needing to remind himself of the power resting there. "I'm going to need you to cooperate," he added, his tone less a request and more a command. But Danielle didn't respond right away. She simply breathed in slowly, the kind of breath that centers you, that grounds you when everything around you tries to push you off balance. And for a brief second, something flickered across Ryan's face, uncertainty, quickly buried beneath authority, because men like him weren't trained to question themselves. They were trained to act, to assume, to decide. The porch light of a nearby house flicked on, illuminating a couple standing just inside their doorway, watching, waiting, not stepping out. The glow reflecting off the lens of a phone held steady, recording every second. Danielle finally spoke, her voice low, controlled. "Officer, there's no reason for this to go any further." The words were simple, but the way she said them carried weight, like a line drawn quietly but firmly in the sand. Ryan let out a short breath, almost a laugh, dismissive, convinced this was just another moment where he held all the control, where the outcome was already decided. And yet something about her stillness lingered, something about the way she didn't rush to explain herself, didn't plead, didn't argue, just stood there as if time itself was on her side. And somewhere in the distance, faint at first but growing closer, the low rumble of an approaching engine began to cut through the quiet night, unnoticed by most, but not by her. The sound of the engine grew louder now, no longer distant, no longer easy to ignore, a low steady rumble rolling down the street like something inevitable. But Officer Ryan Cole did not turn, not yet, his attention still fixed on Danielle Brooks, as if the world behind him did not exist, as if nothing could interrupt the authority he believed he held in that moment. His jaw tightened slightly, a subtle shift that revealed more than his words ever would, because somewhere beneath the surface, something about her composure was beginning to unsettle him. "I told you to cooperate," he repeated, slower this time, more deliberate, as though saying it again would make it true, would make her respond the way he expected. But Danielle did not move, did not raise her voice, did not offer excuses or explanations. She simply stood there, steady, grounded, her eyes never leaving his. And that was the part that did not make sense, because most people in this situation filled the silence with nervous words, with apologies, with fear, but she offered none of that. Only presence, only stillness, and it pressed against him in a way he could not quite define. The flashing lights reflected across her face, red then blue then red again, each pulse illuminating the quiet strength in her expression, the kind that does not come from defiance, but from certainty. And for a brief second, Ryan hesitated, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for something to shift inside him. The engine sound grew closer, tires rolling slowly over asphalt, and now even the onlookers began to glance past him, their attention pulled toward the approaching vehicle, a dark SUV moving with purpose, not fast, not reckless, but deliberate, like it knew exactly where it needed to be. Ryan finally turned his head just slightly, a quick glance over his shoulder, more out of irritation than concern, as if the interruption itself was an inconvenience. And then he looked back at Danielle, doubling down, because backing away was not something he knew how to do. "Last warning," he said, his voice lower now, tighter, the kind of tone meant to end conversations. But Danielle exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet finality that cut through the tension like a line drawn in stone. "You are not in control of this situation," she said, not as a challenge, not as a threat, but as a fact, and something in the air shifted the moment those words left her lips. The SUV came to a stop just a few yards away, the engine idling, headlights casting a steady white beam across the scene, washing over Ryan's uniform, over Danielle's calm figure, over the small crowd that had now gone completely silent, the kind of silence that comes when people sense something bigger is about to unfold. A door opened, the sound sharp and precise in the quiet night, and footsteps followed, measured, confident, each one echoing just enough to be felt. Not rushed, not uncertain, but controlled. Ryan straightened slightly, his posture instinctively adjusting, though he did not fully understand why, because something about those footsteps carried weight, the kind that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway. Danielle's gaze shifted for the first time, not in fear, not in relief, but in recognition, as if this moment had already been accounted for long before it ever arrived. And as the figure stepped into the light, the balance of power that had defined the entire encounter began to tilt, quietly at first, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably. And for the first time since this began, Officer Ryan Cole was no longer the only one holding authority in that space. The man stepped fully into the beam of light, his silhouette sharpening into focus with every step he took, tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit that did not try to impress, but somehow commanded attention anyway, his presence alone shifting the atmosphere in a way that no raised voice ever could. And when he stopped just beside Danielle, there was no rush, no panic, just a quiet certainty that seemed to settle over the entire street. His eyes moved once, taking in the scene, the flashing lights, the officer, the small crowd, and finally resting on Ryan Cole with a calm that did not need to announce itself. "Officer," he said, his voice even, controlled, but carrying a weight that made the word feel different, like it meant something more than it had a moment ago. Ryan frowned slightly, the confidence in his stance tightening rather than relaxing, because men like him did not respond well to interruption, especially not from someone who did not immediately explain themselves. "This is an active situation," Ryan replied, his tone firm, trying to reassert control, to pull the moment back into something familiar, something he understood. But the man did not step back, did not raise his voice, did not challenge him in the way Ryan expected. Instead, he simply reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, not sudden, not threatening, just precise, and for a brief second, the air seemed to hold its breath, the kind of pause that stretches longer than it should, before he revealed a badge, held steady, angled just enough for the flashing lights to catch it, reflecting a sharp glint that cut through the darkness. Ryan's eyes flickered to it, just for a moment, and that was all it took, because recognition does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes quietly, settling in before you have time to deny it. The crowd shifted slightly, murmurs beginning to ripple at the edges, phones still raised. Capturing every second, Danielle remained still, her expression unchanged. But there was something different now, something almost imperceptible, like the tension that had surrounded her was no longer pressing inward but beginning to push outward. The man spoke again. "You are going to lower your weapon," not as a suggestion, not as a demand filled with anger, but as a simple statement of what was about to happen, and that was what made it land. Because there was no uncertainty in his voice, no hesitation. Ryan's grip tightened instinctively, not out of intent, but out of habit, his mind catching up to a situation that was no longer moving in his direction. "And you are?" Ryan asked, though the question sounded weaker than he intended, as if he already knew the answer would not help him. The man's gaze did not shift, did not waver. "Marcus Brooks," he said, letting the name sit in the space between them, followed by a brief pause that felt heavier than any explanation. And then, calmly, Federal Oversight Division. The words were not loud, but they carried through the street like a ripple, reaching the ears of the onlookers, settling into the silence. And in that moment, everything that had seemed certain just minutes ago began to unravel. Ryan's posture adjusted again, subtle but undeniable, his authority no longer unquestioned, his assumptions no longer solid. The radio on his shoulder crackled to life suddenly. A burst of static followed by a voice that confirmed what had just been said, repeating the name, the division, the clearance. And there it was, the final piece. Not dramatic, not explosive, just undeniable truth. And for the first time that night, Ryan Cole stood in a situation he did not control, facing someone who did not need to raise his voice to take it away. The words from the radio did not echo loudly, but they did not need to. They settled into the air like a quiet verdict, final and unmoving. And for a moment no one spoke, not the crowd, not Danielle, not even Ryan Cole, whose stance now carried a tension that had not been there before, the kind that comes when certainty begins to slip. His eyes moved again to the badge, then back to Marcus Brooks, as if searching for something that could undo what he had just heard, something that would return the moment to what it was just seconds ago. But nothing did, because truth does not bend once it is seen. Marcus did not step closer, did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, calm and grounded, his presence filling the space without effort. "You are going to take a breath," he said evenly, not as an order shouted across distance, but as a steady instruction meant to slow everything down. And it worked, not because Ryan wanted it to, but because the situation no longer belonged to him. The flashing lights continued to paint the street in restless color, but the energy had shifted. What once felt like pressure directed at Danielle now circled back toward him. The watching eyes no longer uncertain but focused, aware, waiting. Ryan exhaled, almost unconsciously, the first real sign that the control he had been holding on to was beginning to loosen. His hand lowered slightly, not all at once, but enough to be seen, enough for the moment to change direction. Danielle remained still, her calm now understood in a way it had not been before, not as defiance, not as denial, but as knowledge. She had known how this would unfold, or at least she had trusted that it would. Marcus glanced briefly at her, just enough to confirm what needed no words, and then his attention returned to Ryan. "This interaction is being documented," he added, his tone unchanged, but the implication clear. The phones in the crowd, the cameras, the quiet witnesses who had said nothing but seen everything. All of it now part of something larger than a simple stop on a quiet street. Ryan swallowed, the movement subtle but visible, his posture adjusting again, less rigid now, less certain, the kind of shift that does not come from instruction but from realization. "I was following procedure," he said, the words coming out slower than before, as if he was hearing them at the same time everyone else was, measuring them, testing whether they still held weight. Marcus did not react immediately. He allowed the silence to sit for a second longer, long enough for the meaning behind those words to be felt. And then he responded, "Procedure requires judgment," he said calmly. "And judgment requires responsibility." There was no anger in his voice, no accusation thrown like a weapon, just a statement that settled deeper than any raised tone could have. The radio crackled again, softer this time, but enough to remind everyone that this moment had extended beyond this street, beyond these few people, that it had reached places where decisions would be made without emotion, without assumption, just fact. Ryan's shoulders dropped slightly, the weight of that realization becoming harder to ignore. The street that had once felt like his domain now felt different, smaller somehow, washed in a way it had not been before. And as the silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the SUV and the distant sound of traffic, one thing became clear to everyone standing there. The situation had not just changed, it had turned completely. And the man who thought he was in control was now standing in the very position he had placed someone else in just moments earlier. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like something heavy being moved just enough to reveal what had been hidden underneath. And in that quiet, Ryan Cole felt it. Not from Marcus, not from Danielle, but from the weight of every eye now fixed on him. The same eyes that moments ago had been watching her, judging her, waiting for her to react. And now those same eyes were watching him instead, measuring, questioning, recording, and that change was something he could not ignore. His hand lowered further, not as a decision but as a realization, because the certainty that once held it steady had begun to dissolve. The street no longer felt like a place where he set the tone. It felt like a place where the tone had already been set without him. Marcus remained still, composed, not pressing forward, not escalating, because he did not need to. The moment was already doing the work. "We are going to reset this," Marcus said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension not by force but by clarity. "No one here is a threat, and no one here is above accountability." The words settled in the air, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable, and Ryan heard them, really heard them, in a way that made it harder to hold on to the version of the situation he had created in his mind. He nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, the first sign of acknowledgement that things were no longer what he thought they were. Danielle shifted her weight just a fraction, the smallest movement, but it carried meaning now, because it was no longer the movement of someone being held in place by pressure. It was the movement of someone who knew that pressure had passed. Her voice came again, steady, measured. "I told you this did not need to go any further." And there was no satisfaction in her tone, no victory, just truth, the kind that does not need to celebrate itself. Ryan exhaled again, longer this time, the breath leaving him like something he had been holding onto without realizing it. "I made an assessment," he said, the words slower, more careful, "based on what I saw." And even as he said them, they sounded different, less certain, as if he was hearing the gaps in his own reasoning. Marcus gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without endorsing it. "And now you are seeing more," he replied, not correcting, not accusing, just placing the next step in front of him. The radio on Ryan's shoulder crackled once more, this time with instructions, quiet but firm, requesting his identification, requesting confirmation. The kind of language that signaled a shift from assumption to review, from control to oversight. Ryan reached for his radio, his movements slower, more deliberate, aware now that every action carried weight beyond this street, beyond this moment. He responded, giving his name, his badge number, the words leaving his mouth with a formality that had not been there before. And as he spoke, the crowd remained silent, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because something important was happening, something that did not rely on raised voices or sudden actions, but on the steady unraveling of a moment that had been built on the wrong foundation. Marcus stepped slightly to the side, not blocking, not confronting, but creating space, allowing the situation to settle into what it needed to become. Danielle glanced briefly at the people watching, at the phone still held steady, at the quiet witnesses who had stayed, and then back at Ryan, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a calm that now carried something else, something stronger, something rooted in the knowledge that truth does not need to rush, it only needs to arrive. And as the flashing lights continued to pulse against the quiet homes, reflecting off windows and pavement, one thing became impossible to ignore. This was no longer about a stop on a street. It was about a moment where assumptions had met reality, and reality had not stepped aside. The response from dispatch lingered in the air even after the radio fell silent again, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy with implication, and Ryan Cole felt it settle deeper this time, not just as a shift in authority, but as a shift in perspective, the kind that does not happen all at once but unfolds in quiet layers, each one harder to ignore than the last. His hand moved away fully now, no longer hovering, no longer signaling control, just resting at his side as if it had finally accepted what the rest of him was beginning to understand. The flashing lights still pulsed behind him, but they no longer felt like an extension of his power. They felt like a spotlight, illuminating everything that had led to this moment. Marcus Brooks remained composed, his posture unchanged, but his presence now carried something more than authority. It carried resolution, the kind that does not rush forward but waits for the right moment to settle. "We are going to take this one step at a time," Marcus said calmly, his voice steady, measured, not directed at Ryan alone but at the situation itself, guiding it toward clarity, toward accountability. Danielle stood beside him, her calm unwavering. But now it was different, no longer mistaken for passivity. Now it was understood as strength, the kind that does not need to prove itself, the kind that simply exists. Ryan glanced briefly at her, just for a moment. And in that glance there was something new. Not respect yet, not fully, but recognition, the beginning of it, because the assumptions he had made just minutes ago no longer held their shape. They had begun to collapse under the weight of what he now saw, what he now heard, what he now understood. I did not have all the information, he said, the words quieter than before, less defensive, more reflective, and even as he spoke them, it was clear they were not meant to excuse but to acknowledge. Marcus nodded slightly, accepting the statement for what it was, not pushing further, not escalating. Because the moment did not need more pressure, it needed clarity. And that is why. We pause before we act, Marcus replied, his tone even, not harsh, not forgiving, just factual, the kind of statement that does not argue but simply stands. The crowd remained silent, their presence now part of something larger, no longer just observers, but witnesses to a moment that was shifting in real time. Phones still held steady, capturing not just what happened but how it unfolded, how it changed, how it revealed something deeper than the surface interaction. The quiet hum of the SUV continued in the background, steady, grounding, a reminder that this moment, as tense as it felt, was still contained, still controlled, just not by the person who had expected to control it. Ryan adjusted his stance again, more natural now, less rigid, as if he was stepping out of a role he had been playing and into something more real, something more accountable. The radio crackled once more, this time requesting that he stand by, that further review was in progress. The words simple, procedural, but carrying a weight that extended far beyond the street. Ryan responded with a short acknowledgement, his voice steady but changed, no longer sharp, no longer commanding, just present. Danielle took a slow breath, the tension that had once surrounded her now fully dissipated, replaced by something quieter, something grounded. She looked at Marcus briefly, a silent exchange that needed no words, and then back toward Ryan. Not with judgment, not with triumph, but with a calm, understanding that this moment was not about winning. It was about truth settling into place. And as the seconds passed, as the flashing lights continued their steady rhythm against the quiet homes, one thing became unmistakably clear. Control had not been taken, it had been revealed, and what stood in its place now was something far more difficult to ignore: responsibility. The waiting became its own kind of pressure, not loud, not chaotic, but steady, like a weight pressing down on every second that passed. And in that stillness, the shift that had already begun continued to deepen. Ryan Cole stood there, no longer the center of the moment, but a part of it. His posture no longer rigid with certainty, but grounded in something more uncertain, more aware. The kind of awareness that does not come from training alone, but from confrontation with reality. His eyes moved, once more, briefly scanning the faces around him. The neighbors standing quietly on their porches, the glow of phone screens reflecting in their eyes, the silent witnesses who had not stepped forward but had not turned away either. And for the first time, he seemed to understand that this moment was not isolated. It was seen. It was recorded. It would not disappear when the lights turned off. Marcus Brooks remained calm, his presence unchanged. But now there was a subtle shift in the way he held himself, not as someone asserting authority, but as someone ensuring that authority was properly understood. Dispatch is reviewing everything in real time, he said evenly, his voice carrying just enough to reach Ryan without cutting through the quiet of the street. This is no longer just your call. The words were not confrontational, but they landed with precision, because they clarified what had already begun to take shape, that this situation had moved beyond assumption, beyond individual control, into something that required accountability at a higher level. Ryan nodded once, slowly, the motion small but meaningful, as if he was aligning himself with a reality he could no longer deny. Understood, he replied, and this time his voice carried no resistance, only acknowledgement. Danielle stood beside Marcus, her calm now fully grounded. No longer a quiet defiance, but a steady presence that seemed to anchor the moment. She glanced once toward the street beyond the flashing lights, where the quiet of the neighborhood continued uninterrupted, as if the world itself was reminding them that moments like this happen in ordinary places, under ordinary circumstances, but carry consequences far beyond them. Her gaze returned to Ryan, not with judgment, not with accusation, but with clarity, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. The radio crackled again, this time with more direction, instructing Ryan to remain on scene, to await further personnel, the tone measured, procedural, but unmistakable in its intent. This was no longer a moment to resolve quickly. It was a moment to examine, to understand, to address. Ryan responded again, his voice steady, each word chosen carefully, aware now that every detail mattered, that every action would be part of something larger than the moment itself. Marcus stepped slightly forward, not to dominate the space but to guide it, his presence now acting as a stabilizing force rather than a counter. "We are going to let this play out the right way," he said, his tone calm but firm. And in that statement there was a quiet finality, a recognition that the outcome would not be rushed, would not be shaped by assumption, but by fact, by process, by truth. The crowd remained silent, but their silence was no longer passive. It was attentive, engaged, aware that what they were witnessing was not just a situation resolving, but a moment revealing something deeper about how quickly control can be assumed and how firmly it can be taken. Back when truth enters the space, Danielle took another slow breath, the last trace of tension leaving her posture, replaced by something steadier, something resolved. She did not step forward, did not speak again, because she did not need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been made clear, and as the flashing lights continued their steady rhythm against the quiet homes, as the distant sound of another vehicle began to approach, signaling that this moment was about to expand even further, one realization settled into the air with undeniable clarity. What began as a single decision had now become something much bigger, something that would not end on this street, not tonight. The distant sound of another engine grew clearer now, not rushed, not aggressive, but steady, purposeful, and as the second vehicle turned onto the street, its headlights cutting through the rhythm of flashing red and blue, the atmosphere shifted once again, not with tension this time, but with something heavier, something final, the kind of presence that signals a moment is no longer contained, that it is about to be examined, documented, and understood beyond what anyone standing there can control. Ryan Cole straightened slightly, not out of authority but out of instinct, the kind that comes when a situation moves beyond personal judgment into formal review. His eyes followed the vehicle as it came to a slow stop behind his cruiser, the engine idling low, a quiet contrast to the earlier intensity. The doors opened one by one, and additional officers stepped out, their movements measured, professional, not hurried, not alarmed, but aware, very aware. Marcus Brooks did not turn immediately. He allowed the arrival to settle into the space before acknowledging it, because the moment did not need to be rushed. It needed to unfold properly. Danielle Brooks remained still, her calm now anchored in something deeper, not just confidence, but resolution, as if she had already stepped beyond this moment and understood its outcome long before it fully arrived. The new officers approached, their eyes moving quickly between Ryan, Marcus, and Danielle, reading the situation without needing it. Explained. One of them spoke quietly into his radio, confirming positions, confirming names, confirming what had already been set in motion, the process now taking shape in real time. Marcus finally turned slightly, acknowledging the arriving team with a small nod, not as a superior asserting command, but as someone ensuring alignment, ensuring that what happened next followed clarity, not assumption. "We are transitioning this to oversight," he said calmly, his voice steady, reaching both Ryan and the newly arrived officers. And with that single sentence, the structure of the moment became clear. This was no longer an encounter, it was a review. Ryan nodded again, more firmly this time, the acceptance now complete, the resistance gone, because there was nothing left to hold on to. The version of control he had assumed had already dissolved, replaced by something far more structured, far more accountable. Danielle shifted her gaze briefly toward the new officers, her expression unchanged, but her presence now carried a quiet authority of its own, not official, not declared, but undeniable, because she had stood through the moment without breaking, without escalating, without losing herself to the pressure that had been placed on her, and that alone had reshaped everything. One of the officers stepped closer to Ryan, speaking in a low voice, not confrontational, not accusatory, just procedural, asking for clarification, asking for sequence, asking for the details that would now matter far more than assumptions ever did. Ryan responded carefully, his words measured, deliberate, no longer driven by certainty but by accuracy, because he understood now that this was not about defending a decision, it was about explaining it. Marcus stepped back slightly, creating space, allowing the process to move forward without interference, because true authority does not need to dominate. It ensures that the right structure takes over. The crowd remained where they were, quieter now, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition. They were witnessing something that did not happen often, a moment where the shift from assumption to accountability was not hidden, not ignored, but fully visible. Danielle took a slow breath. Her shoulders relaxed, the last remnants of tension leaving her completely. And for the first time since this began, she allowed herself to look away from Ryan, her gaze lifting slightly toward the quiet sky above the street, as if reminding herself that this moment, as heavy as it had been, was only one part of something much larger. And as the officers continued their quiet exchange, as the radios murmured with confirmations and instructions, as the flashing lights reflected off the still windows of the surrounding homes, one truth settled into the air with quiet certainty. This was no longer about what had happened in those first few minutes. It was about what would happen next, and that part had only just begun. The quiet exchange between the officers continued, steady and methodical, each question asked with purpose, each answer given with care, and as the process unfolded, the energy of the street shifted one final time, not with tension, not with uncertainty, but with a kind of clarity that settled deeper than anything before it. Ryan Cole stood there, no longer trying to reclaim control, no longer searching for a way to return the moment to what it had been, because that version of the moment no longer existed. It had been replaced, piece by piece, by something more grounded, more accountable. His voice remained steady as he spoke, recounting the sequence, explaining what he saw, what he believed, what led him to act. But now there was a difference, a pause between his words, a consideration that had not been there before, as if he understood that every detail mattered in a way it had not just minutes earlier. Marcus Brooks stood slightly to the side, allowing the process to move. Without interruption, his presence still, watchful, not imposing, but ensuring that the structure held, that the moment did not drift back into assumption. Danielle Brooks remained beside him, her posture relaxed now, the weight of the encounter no longer pressing against her, her calm no longer mistaken for silence, but understood as strength, the kind that does not demand attention but reshapes everything around it. One of the officers nodded as Ryan finished speaking, making notes, confirming timelines, and then stepped back slightly, the process continuing exactly as it should, not rushed, not forced, but thorough, precise, the kind of process that does not need to prove itself because it is built on truth. The radios murmured softly with updates, confirmations, quiet acknowledgments that extended beyond the street, connecting this moment to something larger, something structured, something that would not fade when the lights were turned off. The crowd began to shift slowly, not dispersing entirely, but easing. The tension that had once held them in place now replaced with a quiet understanding that what they had witnessed had already changed direction. Danielle glanced once more at Ryan, her expression unchanged, not harsh, not forgiving, just clear, and in that clarity there was something that lingered, something that would stay with him long after this moment ended, not because it was spoken, but because it was understood. Marcus finally stepped forward just slightly, enough to bring the moment to its natural close. "This will be reviewed properly," he said, his voice calm, final, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. And Ryan nodded, this time without hesitation, without resistance, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to hold on to except the reality that now stood in front of him. The flashing lights continued their steady rhythm, but they felt different now, less like a signal of control and more like a reminder of visibility, of accountability, of the fact that moments like this do not disappear. They leave traces, they leave questions, they leave change. Danielle took one last breath, steady and quiet, and for the first time since it began, she turned slightly, not away from the situation, but beyond it, as if stepping out of the moment entirely, her steps calm, measured, not hurried, because she had nothing to escape from, nothing to prove. Marcus followed just a step behind. His presence no longer needed to guide the moment, but simply to close it. And as they moved away from the flashing lights, from the quiet crowd, from the street that had held so much tension just minutes before, one truth settled into the air, quiet but undeniable. He had thought he was making a decision, but in the end, the moment had made one for him, and it was not one he would forget.